So, I think we should be very careful of the procedural arguments that are made by this government as being inherently suspect. And while I'm on the subject, I should note that in general we should be very suspicious of the respect or lack of respect for procedural justice, for the law, for the rule of law, indeed for the rule of anything other than the absolute will of the sitting Prime Minister that we see displayed by this government. This is the same government that imposed the Emergencies Act, effectively a kind of martial law, in order to suppress a peaceful demonstration that was happening outside this place, which demonized the individuals involved in that, who were in fact mostly just hardworking citizens who were put in an impossible position by this government's ruthless and unfair actions towards them. A government which attempted under this Prime Minister to suspend the entire workings of responsible government for a year and a half. I can remember coming here in late March 2020, shortly after we'd had COVID had been declared a pandemic, and we were all, of course, in a personal panic, I guess, but we were all told, stay home. Our Prime Minister said, go home and stay home. And I still remember him standing there on Rideau Cottage, misnamed, by the way. Rideau Cottage, you can look it up on Wikipedia, it has its own article, is actually a mansion on the grounds of a 20-acre estate, Rideau Hall. So the Prime Minister from the front steps of his mansion on his 20-acre estate, a man who, when he gets bored of that, could always take off and go to Harrington Lake, breaking, of course, a series of provincial protocols about crossing borders at that time, to stay at Harrington Lake, where he has a beautiful farmhouse. I've been there under a previous Prime Minister. It's gorgeous. It's a private lake up in the mountains. It is spectacular. He could go from one to the other. But there he was saying to people who live in bachelor apartments with no balcony, maybe facing into a light well in the apartment building so they get no natural light, go home, stay home, as if somehow he was their moral superior. And this has been, of course, the theme of this government, endless virtue signaling about its own moral superiority, while at the same time engaging in the most vile practices, squandering the country's money, the inheritance of our children, driving up the price of housing to unaffordable levels, creating a greater disparity of wealth than we have ever seen before, which is getting worse at an increasing pace as they adopt policy after policy, which is designed to take from the taxpayers as a whole, the tax base as a whole, and to transfer to those who happen to be in positions to take advantage of the various things they're offering. And almost every service now that you see from the government that is being created under this government is effectively something that primarily benefits those who are already well off. A great example would be the $10 a day childcare, which is completely unavailable in a rural riding like mine, and which is completely unavailable to anybody who works shift work, who works night, who lives in a rural area, who lacks the transportation to get their child down to the daycare. This basically eliminates the entire working class. It eliminates all the people who, during COVID, because I tried coming in, despite the Prime Minister's injunction for us to stay home, which I regarded as insulting, and also, of course, as an order that cannot be enforced on members of Parliament who have a right to come to Parliament. When I came in, I used to take the O train, and my wife and I have a place in the West End, and we'd take the O train in. The people who were coming in to work at that time were all the working class people who didn't get a chance to stay home when we were told that coming to work put your life in danger. The people who we said were heroes until later on, during the period of the convoy, we decided they were zeros. We decided. They, the Liberals, decided were zeros. Well, those people were on the train. It was very interesting to see. And the mix of people on the train changed in that period. It became a lot less white, became a lot more brown, because whether this government wants to say it or not, increasingly with their immigration policies, there is a clear racial divide between those who have the better jobs, the privileged jobs, the jobs that give you access, among other things, to the reliable hours that allow you to take advantage of that $10 a day daycare. And also, they give you the higher salaries. And those who don't have that option, who have to keep on working during COVID, and who are excluded from programs like this. Is there some kind of compensation for these people where, well, if you can't get it, we'll give you some kind of benefit? No, of course there isn't. Look at the carbon tax. You see the same thing going on. The carbon tax is designed for the purpose of changing incentives. It's overtly designed for the purpose of re-incentivizing, of making it more painful and expensive to use carbon. And of course, what do we mean by carbon? We mean gas or diesel. We mean home heating fuel. We mean the burning of fossil fuels. Well, people who live in rural areas, who drive an older vehicle and can't afford to replace it with one of those fabulous new Cybertrucks, one of which I just saw in Parliament Hill for the first time ever in real life yesterday. I think you must have seen it too, Mr. Speaker. You're nodding, yeah. So it looked as cool in real life and as futuristic as it does in the pictures. Anyway, I guarantee that truck was not driven by a resident of my riding. I guarantee. They cannot afford Cybertrucks or other electric vehicles. And even if they could, the reality is, I can't afford these things. I'm paid an MP salary. I looked into getting a purely electric vehicle. I have a hybrid Toyota Highlander. I looked into, is it possible to get an electric vehicle, an electric SUV? And the answer is you can't. They don't have a long enough range to be workable in rural areas. So we created an incentive that punishes people for having gas-burning vehicles. And we punish people who cannot switch because of the nature of where they live. I guess they could sell and come to the city and say, look, I just give up on living out there. You know, my riding and all ridings in rural Ontario and Nova Scotia, for that matter, are full of abandoned farms from over the decades as it ceased to be economically viable to live in one place or another. But of course, the people who left those farms, who had cleared the land, or their parents had cleared the land to leave, they've lost the value of that asset. So that is augmented, that is increased by what the government is doing. And I come to the city where housing prices and rents have doubled, meaning it's unaffordable. So, and look, people in my constituency are poorer than the average. We are in the bottom quarter of the Ontario population. But there's a long-term pattern that I've seen working here. I've been here a quarter of a century now. When I was first elected in the year 2000, November 27, 2000, there were only two ridings in the province of Ontario. They were won by my party, the Old Canadian Alliance, mine, and Renfrew, Nipissing, Pembroke, directly to our north, both lower than average income rural areas. And within my riding, my old riding of Lanark-Carleton, we had an enormously wealthy area, Canada, which had, among other things, we had a billionaire living there. So I had the wealthiest suburb in Canada. At the far other end of my riding had the poorest municipality, Lanark Highlands, in the entire province, outside of Indigenous areas in Northern Ontario. And interestingly enough, the results were I did worst in the wealthiest areas, best in the poorest areas, and the actual lowest income spot in the entire riding was the only spot where I got more than 50% of the vote at that time. And that's a pattern which has not disappeared. That pattern has replicated itself over and over again, not just in my riding, but across the country. The Liberals are the party of the privileged, the well-off, by which I do not necessarily mean that billionaire I was referring to who made his money in high tech. I am referring to those whose wealth and well-being is the result of what is properly understood as privilege. We hear a lot of nonsense about privilege. I remember on one occasion, one minister, I was asking a question about corrections and rose up and said, well, look, the members are asking the question from a position of privilege. I literally have no idea what that sociological academic babble even means. But real privilege, a privilege is a right which is issued as a license. It is a license right. Your driver's license is a privilege. You can't just hop in a car and drive. It's not an absolute right. You have to fulfill certain things. More and more activities are effectively privileged in this society, privileged to the same people over and over again. And the rules are adjusted as necessary to ensure that those people and their friends and their relatives stay at the top, whether it is through adjusting the zoning laws and the housing regulations and the building costs so that effectively the housing supply is shrunk, making one group of people, I'm fortunate to be in that group of people, those who are older and own homes, wealthier at the expense of those who do not, who happen to be younger, more recently arrived in Canada, and typically browner. Now, if that seems like a picture of social justice, then you have a very different conception of social justice than do I. But that is this government. And this government has also been the opposite of transparency. It has kept us, we have been tied up trying to resolve the issue of getting them to release documents revealing the level of the depth of the scandal, and they've been willing to allow the House business to be held up for over a month while we deal with this. That says a great deal about how much they are committed to having absolute opacity, a black box of government under which they can carry on activities that I think do not meet with the standards of any decent Canadian. Thank you.